Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we're trying to climb to as high a rapid rating as we possibly can, and I'll be explaining my moves as best as I can for your education and entertainment. Today we have a Caro Kann Defense, and we will see what my opponent chooses to do. Okay, knight c3. So this is like one of the more classical systems, and he may play bishop c4, the von Hennig gambit, which is a very interesting line, but he takes on e4 with the knight, and we'll play knight to f6, which basically invites white to take our knight. We take back with the e-pawn, and this is called the Tartakower variation. And the idea of this is that we have these doubled pawns on the f-file, which normally should be a bit of a weakness, and in endgames it is a weakness in lots of scenarios because white can create a passed pawn with this 4 versus 3 far more easily than we can with our 4 versus 3 on the king side. However, you can already see this knight on f3 is misplaced because we have this doubled pawn on f6 where the knight can't advance to either e5 or g5 as a result of our doubled pawn. It also means we have very quick development. We can get our bishop out to d6 where it sits on a very nice diagonal. My opponent goes pawn h3, which is a move. It's made to stop bishop to g4, which can be very annoying for white to deal with, but it is a bit slow. So we'll start by castling. And white can kind of get into trouble already if he's not careful, which sounds a bit crazy to say. But the problem with playing pawn to h3 is that he's wasting a move. We are already castled. White still has 2 moves to castle, so bishop to d3 and castles, right? But we can throw in, if I remember correctly, this move rook to e8 check. Now, why is this a problem? Well, white is going to have to block with the dark squared bishop, obviously. And now, I mean, already you can see ideas of bishop to f4, playing on the fact that the bishop is pinned to the king. And I think we can just go for this immediately, to be fair. And white can't really castle because we will simply play takes, takes, and rook takes and be up a pawn. The open f-file also isn't really a big problem because the rook wouldn't be targeting f7 anyway. It would only be targeting f6, which is well defended. So white plays queen d2, defending the bishop, which of course makes a lot of sense. And okay, here's where I need to consider my options, because my gut wants me to play queen d6 or queen c7, which are basically because if we take, the pawn can take back, which isn't necessarily all that bad for white. If we go queen d6, the threat would be to play takes, takes, and queen to g3 check, and the king would have to move. And if the queen blocks on f2, then we have rook takes the pawn on e3, and the queen can't take because it is pinned. So that's one option. That's one option. But if queen d6, of course, white doesn't have to just let us take, right? He can do something else. For example, he could castle. And okay, I mean, I think we're still doing relatively well after takes and takes. Although maybe e4, e5 could be a problem. So we need to bear that in mind. We could play a move like knight to a6, trying to bring the knight into the game somehow, which is another option. I'm just going to think for a minute about what I want to do. Could play takes, takes immediately. That makes sense. Queen d6, castles. That doesn't really change anything. That's the exact same line. Does c5 make sense? C5 is interesting. If c5 is taken, though, I guess we play takes and takes, and the pawns are quite weak. We also just have queen e7, which I think just wins a pawn outright. Yeah, I think queen e7 just wins a pawn. Just applying even more pressure to the e-file, because the bishop still can't take on f4. I think for some reason I was a little bit... It was a bit of a blind spot, this queen e7 move for me, because typically in the Tartakower, the queen comes to d6 or c7 to line up with the bishop on this diagonal. However, like I said, the way that white has set this up is a bit strange with this early pawn to h3, so I think it makes more sense to try to exploit the white position immediately. Now, we do have to be slightly careful. It's not done and dusted, because, okay, white castles, for example, we take, pawn takes, queen takes, rook takes. Okay, he doesn't actually play that. He goes king to e2, so scrap that. I'll show you in the post-game analysis what I'm talking about, but basically, while I could win a pawn and have a rook on e3, moves like rook to e1 could be slightly concerning with ideas of infiltrating, where I would probably have to take, and after rook takes, go king f8 to cover e7 and e8, and then get the queen side developed. But king e2 is just clearly clearly not good. It's not something that white wants to play. So I think already the opening has been a massive success. 11 moves in. So what's the idea? Well, I assume he wants to play rook e1 and king to f1 to make sure that the bishop is covered. So there is potentially a bit of a time factor to this, in the sense that we need to get the job done, as in maybe securing an extra pawn or something, as quickly as we can. However, we also don't want to overstretch too much. The bishop is still pinned to the king, so there's still no bishop takes on f4. So, okay, what can we do? We could go for c5. We could go for c5 with the idea of playing knight c6 and applying pressure to the d-pawn. That's one option. If c5 and he takes, I can take back because the bishop is still pinned. That's an interesting option. If c5, well, if c5... I'm not going to take. I'm going to go knight c6. So c5, let's say rook e1. Knight c6. If pawn d5, then knight d4 looks pretty damn good. c5, if d5, covering c6. What can we do there? Not 100% sure. That pawn is actually quite annoying. And I can't go knight c6 anymore. So, okay, let's scrap that for now. What about knight d7? I'm not really sure where the knight's going. I'd like to bring it around to d5. I'm just not sure I have the time. If knight d7, rook e1, knight b6, king f1, my bishop is now under attack. Okay, I could take. If queen takes, I might have something like queen f8. Yeah, queen f8 would win there because it would force bishop blocking. Okay, so bishop takes would force pawn takes. The king does have f2 in that position, though. Takes, pawn takes. Am I in a rush to do that, though? Ooh, wait. f5 looks very strong. f5 looks strong. So I can play take, take, and pawn f4. And if pawn e4... maybe c5 in that sort of position. Or even f5 with the other f-pawn. This is interesting. Takes, takes. I know I'm spending a while here, but this feels like a very important moment. If I go f5, then king just moves to f2. So f5 first, and there's no king f2. Let's say rook e1. Takes, pawn takes, f4, king f2. I guess takes just like rook takes. I could trade everything, but I do get rid of my doubled pawn, to be fair. That's not the end of the world. If takes takes, I can also consider a move like bishop to e6, just developing. Not fully convinced, but it wouldn't be a terrible move. Let me have a think. All right, I have taken some more thought, and I think my move of choice is going to be knight to a6. Knight a6 is a strange move, and I did just spend a few minutes off camera trying to figure this out. But my idea is that I want to bring the knight into b4 to attack the bishop and try and bring the knight over to d5 as well. I wasn't too concerned about takes and takes, because I figured then I win the f5 square for my light squared bishop, and this pressure should be pretty good, also with the rook coming to d8 or b8. So I'll show you after the game, but okay, we are a bit low on time, so I assume now I want to take. Takes, again, if queen takes, I just drop my queen back, and the queen is lost, so you have to take with the pawn. I could throw this in first after king to f1, not a massive fan, so let's take. Let's take. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. And let's go knight into b4. So this white king is still struggling for safety. My queen is supporting the knight, so the knight is fine. This type of maneuver with the knight is quite common in lots of Tartakower positions. We could consider bringing the knight into d5, although we don't really have to make a decision just yet. This move pawn to e4 is likely on the way, so f5 might be good to try and stop it. If e4 is played anyway, I probably play takes first. Pawn takes, pawn takes, pawn takes. Interesting. If I take and queen takes and then f5... Yeah, that's interesting, because if knight takes, pawn takes, I might... bishop f5, pawn e4... Bishop back to g6... not convinced. So if takes, f5, e4... Take... not sure. I could drop the knight into d5. e4 will likely happen. I think f5 makes sense. I am giving the e5 square, but I suppose worst case I can always put this pawn on f6. I'm also obviously making sure my knight is still defended. If I can create some kind of clamp on the e4 square, I should be doing very well here, but I guess if I wanted to do that, I probably should have developed more like this to bring the knight into f6, which is also a common way to get the knight into the game. The problem with that, though, is the knight on d7 would have blocked my light squared bishop, so not 100% clear. c5 was also interesting. I guess maybe I could have given that a bit more consideration. Something like c3, knight takes, queen takes. I just don't want to take, because then he takes back with the e-pawn, and he kind of fixes his pawn structure. So, okay, we're down to just under 5 minutes. I need to speed up a little bit here, but I think the opening has gone relatively well. I mean, the white king will get to some kind of safety, but it's not the end of the world. Okay, bishop c4. Bishop c4. Well, how on earth is he playing e4 now? I think I can get away with knight to d5. Because if takes and takes happens, we have this bind on the e4 square, which looks devastating to me. g6, and this pawn structure is lovely. Even f6 if we need to keep the knight out of e5. Okay, I don't mind this. To be fair, we could even play a move like knight back to f6 if we want, to try and bring the knight into e4. That wouldn't be ridiculous. Not a massive fan of this move for white. I thought this pawn might want to come to c4, try and create a breakthrough, but we'll see what he goes for. If takes, then c4 also becomes more difficult. But then I guess the question is the knight better than the bishop or not? Because I do have a lot of pawns on light squares. So probably a little bit unclear. I mean, I briefly considered bishop to e6 in this position, but the problem is after bishop takes, queen takes, my knight hangs. So it doesn't quite work. Okay, knight to e5 on the board. So if I move the knight, he can take on f7. However, if knight f6, bishop f7, queen f7, knight f7, knight e4 check, king moves to e2 to defend the queen, knight takes, knight d6, attacking my rook. It's complicated. Knight f6, bishop f7, queen f7, knight f7, knight e4, king e2, knight d2, knight d6, rook e6, knight c8, knight back to e4, and his knight is trapped. Yes, his knight is trapped. So knight f6 can be considered. F6 could also be considered, but kind of like this. I'm going to go for it. I think I've calculated that correctly. So I think at the end of the line, his knight gets trapped. And if he doesn't play knight d6, I'm just going to go up a piece. So if here, and takes, then I take on f7, and I'm up a bishop. And he does play it, but yeah, I'm pretty sure I can take this. And I'm going to assume that he missed the fact that I can take. I'm going to assume that. So yeah, knight f7, knight e4. King e2 looks like the only move, because the queen's undefended otherwise. Knight d2. Knight e4, king e2. Knight d2. If knight d6, rook e6, knight c8, knight e4. Yeah, I think that works. And the knight is trapped. I believe. Because I'm covering both of the escape squares. If he takes, then I take. Yeah, and if he takes on c8, I just retreat my knight. And this knight is trapped. The move like rook f1, I also have knight g3, which is very cheeky. So I think I'm just completely winning. Whew. And this is why it took a long time earlier on in the game with that knight to a6 move and my opponent resigns. Yeah, because the problem is that this knight has no way out. The best move is knight a7, rook a7, and here I have a knight for a pawn. But it's even worse than that, really, because this e3 pawn is so weak, and my knight it can't be kicked away from the e4 square, which is absolutely glorious. So that was a really nice game. Let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay. I played at 99% accuracy. I really want to know. I mean, knight a6 must have been the best move. I would think that was like the move I really had to think hard about. My opponent played at, I think, 90% accuracy. 90.6, yeah. But that was tricky. So, okay, e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, d4, knight e4. Here, you can kind of choose between bishop f5, knight f6, or knight d7. All of them are valid. In my course, first link in the description for a free trial, by the way, prefer knight to f6. And you do invite the alien gambit with knight g5. But you can check out some of my other videos on the channel against the alien gambit. And I don't play h6, I play bishop to f5, and I quite like these positions. So we have takes, e-takes, and knight f3. And knight f3 is an odd move, because after bishop to d6, normally you'll get bishop d3. And after castles, bishop g4, black is in pretty good stead, because it's very hard to break this pin without dropping the bishop back to e2. And then you can get into a lot of trouble anyway. So... And by the way, let me show you an interesting line. So like bishop d3, castles, bishop g4, bishop e3, rook e8. Can I remember the line? Bishop back to e2, f5, c3. Yeah, I think c3, knight d7, queen d2. And then here, I mean... And I've had this before, by the way. Like, I've had this position before. After pawn to f4, white is already in, like, basically lost. Because after bishop f4, rook e2, queen e2, bishop f4, black has two pieces for the rook, which is obviously really, really nice. And after something like knight d7, queen c3, pawn f5, again, we have the same idea after queen to d2. You could even get into trouble after a move like queen d3, after pawn to f4, bishop d2. Okay, no, h3 should have been included as well. Sorry, let me just reset a second. Queen c7, h3, bishop h5, queen d2, now pawn f5, queen d3, giving the bishop an escape square. After pawn f4, bishop d2, bishop g6, attacking the queen. The queen needs to defend the bishop. And after something like queen c4, b5, queen b3, and rook takes e2. I've had this exact line happen like 2 or 3 times over the past month. So, like, no joke, the Tartakower is very dangerous for white to deal with. But my opponent plays h3, which stops bishop to g4. But after castles, which is the best move, bishop d3, white is in trouble after rook e8 check, as we saw in the game. And I mean, black is already better, which is crazy on move 8 with the black pieces. The bishop has to come to e2, but the problem with that is after rook e8 castles, we get bishop to f5. And the engine says equal, but I think these positions are probably easier to play with the black pieces, to be honest. So we have bishop d3, rook e8, bishop e3, bishop f4. The engine actually wants the immediate knight to a6. Interesting. And if takes... Oh, queen a5. I completely missed that. I have studied this before. And yeah, this is just very good because white can't castle. So after something like queen to e2, which is the only move, something like take, pawn f5, we have a very similar idea to what we had in the game. After something like king to d3, pawn f4, bishop back to c1, bishop to f5 check, king d2. I mean, this is clearly better for us. But okay, I go bishop to f4. We have queen d2, best move. Queen e7, best move. I was trying to figure out... I was trying to figure so many things out here. Queen e7 is the only move to hold equality for black. I was considering pawn c5. And I was thinking, okay, I mean, if something like takes, then after something like takes and takes, queen c7 could be quite strong, hitting the pawn, targeting the g3 square. And if white plays a move like b4 to defend the pawn, for example, a5 is the best move. But I was thinking about like queen g3, queen f2, rook e3 check ideas, king f1. The problem here, though, is that the engine still likes the position for white, because after something like takes, and I retreat the rook after rook to e1, I'm too slow in my development. So I can't connect my rooks fast enough. I need 2 moves. I only have 1 move, right? So, okay. Queen e7, best move. King e2. Here, c5 is the best move. Knight a6 is the second best move. Okay. So what I couldn't figure out was after c5, I thought, okay, if something like c3, then after cd4, knight c6, I thought this looked very nice. I have ideas of knight b4, I have ideas of knight d4. My bishop's ready to come out. Bishop e6, bishop d5 maybe, rook d8. I thought this was great. What I couldn't figure out was after c5 and d5, I saw knight d7, and after rook to e1, I couldn't figure this out, because I was thinking, okay, knight b6, but then the king just runs away, and, like, this is actually quite concerning, which is true. What I needed to find was bishop e3, fe3, and knight to e5. I didn't even consider this. I mean, what is the idea? Because this d-pawn looks very dangerous. After, let's say, c4, the engine wants b5, and if takes, bishop... Okay, no, that's very complicated. I honestly prefer my move knight to a6. I think practically it makes more sense. So here, I was obviously allowing my opponents to play bishop takes a6, and I was just going to have to deal with this pawn structure. But I wasn't too concerned, because after something like rook to e1, bishop e3, fe3, I thought after bishop f5, which the engine does actually quite like, I thought this was pretty good for me, because let's say king to f2, right? Bishop e4. This pawn is a permanent weakness, and it can never, ever advance. Let's say something like c4, for example, trying to break through. Engine here likes f5, maybe looking for f4, maybe even g5, g4. Wouldn't even be ridiculous. I just thought we had quite a nice position here. I mean, like knight e5. Here, the engine likes a5. I'm not sure I'd be playing a5, to be honest with you. Something like queen d6 looks natural. And we have an interesting game. This king is never going to be completely safe, and my bishop is effectively unassailable on the e4 square. But my opponent goes rook h2 e1, which is the best move, and here we have to take. The thing is, if I play knight b4 immediately, then there's king f1. And now if I take on e3, then he gets rook e3. And then the only move is to block on e6 with the bishop, which is a bit uncomfortable, right? So we have to take, forcing f takes, because if queen takes, I was going to play queen to f8. And the queen is pinned to the king, so you have to block with the bishop, but then f5 and I win the bishop. So that's completely winning. So you have to take with the f-pawn. And here knight b4 is the best move. Targeting the bishop, right? And, okay, here I did not... Sorry, no, here I did expect this move, king f2. I thought he might play pawn e4 immediately. And after knight d3, cd3, keeping a hold of the center, I thought this was quite an interesting position. White has his pawn blob in the center, which could be strong, but it could also be weak, depending on what happens. My bishop doesn't have, like, really easy development. Maybe e6 makes sense. Something like king f2 in rook ad8. Interesting, who knows? But king f2, here taking is fine. f5 is also fine. And I was fully expecting e4. I was fully expecting this move. And I was going to play takes. And after c takes, the engine likes queen to d6 in this position. But I was just going to figure this out, to be honest. I wasn't 100% sure. And if queen takes, then of course I can take here and go up a pawn. So, yeah, I was pretty happy with the position. So we have bishop c4, which is actually the best move. And we play knight d5, the best response. a5 is also playable, keeping an eye on the knight. But yeah, I mean, we've got to be slightly careful of knight e5 ideas. So I thought, okay, knight d5, let's block this diagonal. And if this is taken, I thought this was bad for white, which it is, because after cd5, you could argue my bishop doesn't have a clear way into the game, which is true. I also have an isolated d-pawn, which is true, but how are you really going to target that? But I'm stopping c4, and I'm stopping e4. I have the open c file and the open e file, which could be both useful. I could even launch a kingside attack, potentially, so I thought this was really nice for us. My opponent plays knight e5. Here, I did actually miss this queen h4 move, because the knight no longer watches. And if g3, I can't take here, because there's takes, and rook h1 trapping my queen. Okay. So where would I have to go? I'd have to come back to e7. Okay, that's a bit strange. I guess I induce a weakness, but I quite like the move knight to f6. And knight f6 sets a trap, obviously, as we saw in the game. Knight f6, even if white doesn't fall for the trap, is still a very good move. Now, what should white do here? Well, the best move is king g1. And on king g1, I was going to play bishop to e6. Because I couldn't really play bishop to e6 in... Was it this position? Yeah, I couldn't play it here. Because if takes, I can't take with a queen because my knight hangs. That's the big problem. So I have to play knight d5 first. Then I can set it up. So if king g1, bishop e6, you probably have to take. And after something like queen takes, my knight comes into e4. And I'm just better. I mean, like c4, knight e4, let's say queen c2. Here, maybe f6, kicking his knight away. It's not the best move. But you can see already that I think black is clearly has an edge in this position. But I'm also baiting bishop f7. So I can sack my queen. And after knight f7, we have knight to e4, king e2, and knight takes d2. The problem for white is that he's down a piece in this position. And knight d6 looks like it works, but as we saw in the game, it doesn't. And if you take my knight, I'll take your knight, and I'm just up a piece for a pawn. So knight d6 almost works. Almost works. And in fact, I could even get away with knight e4, and after knight e8, play bishop to e6, according to the engine. And after knight c7, bishop c4, check. King f3, rook c8, I trap the knight. That's obviously way more complicated, and I will end up with two pieces for a rook. But if rook e6, which is the best move by far, the knight has no moves. I mean, even if you could go to c4, which you can't, I'd still take you. And if knight to f5, I just bring my knight out, and I have a knight for 2 pawns. Sorry, a bishop for 2 pawns. Even so, the white king is stranded, e3 is weak, my knight is still glorious, even though it's not defended by a pawn, it still can't really be kicked away. So we have knight c8. It would be a terrible blunder to take, because after king takes d2, I'm just down a pawn in a rook endgame. So after knight e4, my opponent resigns, because the knight has no way out, and the best case scenario is for me to be up a knight for 2 pawns. But like I said at the end of the game, it's far worse than that. This knight is amazing, and this pawn is incredibly weak. I also have open file for my rook. Realistically, I probably would just double on the e-file and take advantage of the weak e-pawn. Maybe white can play this on, but realistically, it's going to be quite a long and grueling, suffering defeat. I don't know if that was good English. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And, yeah, some videos are going to be popping up here. Check them out if you're interested. If you want to find my full Caro Kann course, first link in the description. You can get a free 7-day trial. So if you don't like it, you can cancel. I don't even think you have to provide any payment information. So literally no risk. But anyway, have a good one.